as I can. So it's probably now time for us to kick off the conversation properly. Get rid of my paperwork. So joining me on the panel here, I have three debut authors. I have Jo Dixon, Lucy Campbell, and Joan Sowers. Did I get that right? Yes. Okay. The books that we're talking about is The House of Now and Then, Lowbridge, and Echo Lake. So first of all, I thought I'd just give you a little précis of the books. So I know that most of you have probably read them already, but if you haven't and you're kind of interested to kind of maybe, am I going to go buy this one? You will be buying it by the end of the session. So I'll kick it off with The House of Now and Then. This is it's a story. It's a woman called Olivia. She's retreated to Tasmania after a bit of a public scandal, and a young man knocks on her door with a story from 30 years ago that happened in the same house that she's renting. And so Olivia then attempts to unravel what happened 30 years ago, and it's a crime with a strong romantic thread dealing with two time frames. The other book there we have is Lowbridge, Lucy on the end there, and her story is around Catherine. And Catherine has returned to the country town that her husband was brought up in, and she's gone there to grieve the death of her daughter. She's lost, she's emotionally scarred, and she finds herself drawn to the local historical society, where she finds the story in the catalogue of a young girl who went missing in 1987, and in the process she uncovers a second missing girl. It's a community with deep secrets, retribution, and the concept of justice, and ultimately a story of redemption. And then finally we have Echo Lake, which again we have Rose, the historical researcher, and for those of you who don't know, that's actually one of my jobs, so I was quite drawn to this one. Rose, she's relocated to the Southern Highlands, and she's had a bit of a run-in with the local psychopath. And fearing for her safety, she sets about sort of protecting herself, and in the process she uncovers a roll of film. And exploring this roll of film and using her researching skills for good, she works out that the images on the film are of a missing woman called Maria Aboud. And the other thing that's really great about Echo Lake is it has a map in the front. And for those of you who are Chris Hammer fans, it's the same cartographer who's done the map. So there you go. So they're the three books. So please sit back as we kind of now interrogate these authors on their debut books. Now, is there one of you who wants to go first? I'm going to ask if each of you. All right.
Oh, wait, I want to go.
Oh, okay. Well, I can go.
Let's do the question.
Well, I'm going to change it up. I'm going to go to my general questions and ask all three a question instead of going to the... So now that you're published, is it everything you expected it to be?
I'll go first. When you're an aspiring writer, there's this goalpost out there that you're just working heart and soul to get to. When you get there, it is a surreal moment. You've heard that probably 100 times from 100 different authors. What I likened it to was turning up at a club and suddenly you're a guest that you're allowed in, and someone moves that velvet rope, draws back the curtain and ushers you into this elusive club, and then you realise you know nothing. And you've got to learn all the rules of this exclusive club and wallow in it, because it's amazing. So was it all I expected? Yes. Was there much more to it than what I expected? Oh, hell yes. It's an amazing world with incredible people. Crime writers are just the nicest people. They put everything on the page, but in real life they're just warm, welcoming, encouraging, supportive. So that side of it has been more than I expected, actually. And along the way there've been a lot of lessons about the industry and how it all works. But at the end of the day, it's incredibly satisfying.
My experience has been incredibly positive, especially because I'm coming from film and television, which is a horrifying hellhole of an experience for much of the time. Not because there aren't nice people, but there's just too many of them giving you opinions, whereas when you write a book, it's just you. And by the time it gets to an editor, most of the hard work is done, and the rest of it has been so smooth and easy that I feel like I never want to leave the world of publishing. And as Joe said, weirdly, crime writers are the nicest, warmest people. So we obviously have dark sides that we're not,
Yeah.
that we're putting on the page.
That's right. I think we exercise our demons on the page.
I feel like it happens so incrementally that sometimes you don't really feel that you've reached the stage. Like, you know, there's all these things that happen. You get an agent, you get a publisher, suddenly your book's out, and you're kind of like, do I celebrate at every point, or is there a single moment? And I don't think there is a single moment. It's all those little things along the way that you don't realise till those moments have passed. Oh, that was pretty amazing. I probably should have done something about that. So it's been fantastic, really, really good. And I would say the same about meeting people and also meeting people in the audience who have been so supportive and so nice. And it's really good to hear readers' feedback. And also just that thing of walking past a bookshop and looking in and going, it's my book. I don't think you can ever get tired of that. And I came from a background of newspaper and magazine journalism, which, like film and TV, was pretty brutal, or could be pretty brutal. And so when I got my first round of edits back, and anything that my editor was querying or wanted me to think about, she had written very politely, NQR for not quite right. Whereas in a newsroom, you would just be torn to pieces in front of everyone. So it was really gentle and really kind, and it's been completely different in that way to anything I expected.
It is quite an adjustment, isn't it? I mean, my background is film and television as well. And I remember the first edit, and it's like, how would you feel? Don't have to. This isn't quite right. Whereas in TV, it's like, they swear at you, they throw the script across the table. It's so brutal. Am I wrong that all three of you have a writing background before the book?
I don't.
Right. So what led you to writing the book?
Well, when I say I had no writing background, I'm talking about professional writing. I've, of course, been writing since I was, could hold a pencil. But it's just one of those things I've always wanted to do. I've always tried to put little stories down, and I think I got serious about writing about 10 years ago. I thought it was just time. If not now, when? It's one of my favourite sayings. And just applied myself diligently to the process and got there.
Yeah. Well, the other two here, was it a sense of frustration with your professional other lives that led to the book, or what was the catalyst?
I had always wanted to write a murder mystery, and I don't know what took me so long, because I've had other books published, nonfiction though, and I'd worked in television and written mysteries and worked on mysteries as a script producer, but it wasn't until COVID and the pandemic, and I moved to the Southern Highlands, and it was that location that it all coalesced. Everything that I had always dreamed of in terms of the setting and the characters, they all emerged in the Southern Highlands. And I couldn't believe that there hadn't been a series set in, the misty, kind of very Scottish, English, small town vibe, which is exactly the settings of sort of cozy crime stories that I love. So it was that made me think, oh, okay, this is, if not now, when. So I started then, and it just flowed out of me. And since then, I'm about to deliver the second novel in the series, which is, I no longer live there, but it's still that setting. So for me, that was what really led me into the fictional crime world.
And Lucy?
I'd always worked in media and comms, so I was always writing for other people. And then I used to work Monday to Thursdays and had Fridays off, and I thought I'm just going to sort of get back to fiction, which I'd put aside. I'd always really enjoyed it, but I just hadn't done it over the last few years. So I thought I'll give Fridays over to that and see how I go. And I'd just forgotten how much I enjoyed it, that freedom. And at that stage, I wasn't expecting anything to come of it. I was writing purely for myself, for enjoyment. And it was so freeing, and I just loved being able to do that again. And then once I found my story, I got to the point where I thought I was going to work and just hanging out for lunch, so I could sit and get back to my own thing. Maybe even doing it a little bit of it in work time.
Yeah.
So I thought I've just got to throw this in and give the whole thing a proper go, or yeah, again, it's a now or never moment. You just have to bite the bullet and say,
Yeah.
I'm giving this all that I can. So that's what I did through in my day job and took a risk.
That's an interesting point there. Like, I mean, how do the three of you juggle, life and writing? Because there's very few of us who are fortunate to be full-time writers, and
over the say let's say 10 years that I've been working hard at this. The earlier years were harder because my kids were younger. I had a routine. We live in rural Tasmania, so we've got a bit of driving to do quite frequently. And I believe in the maxim that writing is not just tippy-tapping on the keyboard, it's in your head. It's the process of visualising, of imagining, of creating in your head. I had to do an hour and a half return trip to the kids' school in the morning and an hour and a half return trip in the afternoon. Teenagers don't want to talk to you in the car, so I would run the movie of these books through my head and hope that they would stick, because it's very hard to take notes. So yeah, for me, that was how I juggled it in the early days. So a lot of creative thinking while I was driving. These days, those teenagers are now gone, in a nice way. They've gone off to university, so I'm empty nester. Now my responsibility are all the animals we've got. So my day is bookended by making sure that the sheep don't die. And in between that, I write pretty much full time when I'm not at the local hall committee or the gardening group or all those lovely small town rural activities that one must take part in.
surely they're research for the next book.
Oh yes, I've got some names in mind.
I don't really have to do that much juggling anymore. My daughter has flown the coop, and although I do babysit the two grandsons from time to time, but mostly writing, I'm a full-time writer, and I love it. I love being, I haven't had like a regular job, a day job. I worked for 1 year at Screen Australia in 2008, and it nearly killed me. I don't understand how people go to work every day, but I'm very good at self-discipline. So I work every day at my, laptop, and I don't have to force myself because it's my happy place. I just really love being there, and so yeah, it's not too much of a juggling act at all.
Lowbridge was definitely a juggling act. I had two teenagers living at home when I started and a daughter in primary school, and it was very much writing in between their commitments and my job and everything else. And a lot of my thinking was done driving to sport or watching sport. Watching sport, of course, but still thinking about it. And then once I sort of decided to give it a go full-time, give writing a go full-time, it's been a lot easier, and I just don't think there's a single moment where I haven't walked into my little studio at the bottom of the garden and felt so incredibly lucky to be able to do it. And even though I still only work really between school hours, I can still go for a walk or a run and do all that plotting and working out. But yeah, it just feels like an incredibly fortunate place to be, and I think the love of it keeps you going, and I think that's true of all writers, whether you're published or not. Something compels you to keep going with it, even when none of it makes sense and when it is a juggle.
Yeah, I always think stories infect us. Got to get them out. Got to get them. Yeah. Well, we are here to talk about the books as well as these authors. So, because we're talking Lucy, I may as well stick with you. I was really struck with your book. There's sort of it reminded me of Hayley Scrivener's Dirt Town. And I was wondering whether there was any authors or work that kind of inspired you, or you sort of, fed off in the sort of process of creating your work.
Not necessarily. So the way Lowbridge came about was, as I said, I'd just sort of been writing for myself. Then I was down at the local supermarket one day going to get some milk, and they had milk cartons with photos of missing people on them as part of Canberra National Missing People's Week, or Missing Persons Week. And I just sort of stood there reading them, and some of them were recent cases and some of them were from 30, 40 years ago. And it just got me wondering how on earth someone could just disappear like that back then, and it still happens now. So that was sort of the basis of it. And I hadn't read an awful lot of crime. I didn't intend to sit down and write a crime. It was the story that appealed to me, and then the crime sort of came in around that. So since it's been published, I've read a lot more of my contemporary crime writers, which I've really, really enjoyed. And I've also gone back to old stories that I've really liked, like Patricia Highsmith and Rebecca, which isn't really a traditional crime novel, but of course it is. So yeah, I would say I read a real mixture of contemporary and old, and I will always go back to favourites. And if I'm ever stuck on anything, I will pick up something new and something old and just flick through, and there will always be a sentence or a word in there that rejigs my brain, and I know where I'm going again.
Do you remember where your character of Catherine came from? Did she emerge from the story, or was she, at the beginning?
I can't remember what she was always in it. She was the main character right from the start, and I'm not quite sure how she came about in terms of her own grief. She just sort of made sense to me all the way along. I thought it needs to be someone damaged, looking after, who's not engaged with the outside world, who's not focusing or living normally, and of course grief really ties into that. So she came out of that.
And she's self-medicating quite heavily at the start of the book as sort of a part of that grief process. And I kind of thought you were playing with the broken detective trope, but
no,
maybe
not
not.
intentionally. I never wanted to write about detectives or police procedure. Not that I don't enjoy reading them, but I didn't feel in a position to do justice to that. It had to be an ordinary person, but she also had to be someone broken and damaged who's seeking something. And I also like the idea, which wasn't terribly nice of her, and that was another reason that I really like Catherine. She's not instantly likeable, but I like the idea of her using someone else's grief to get through her own, and that doesn't have to be an attractive thing to do, but I think it's quite a human thing to do.
And the other, all three books are really kind of digging into that kind of historical research, different time frames, and your book it's set in the 1980s. You kind of explore the victim's world, and then you kind of have the contemporary as well. Did you prefer being in one world to the other, or was it?
I loved writing my 1980s teenagers. I was a teenager in the 1980s, so it was really fun to look back on the fashion and the music and those sorts of vibes. So I could have fun with that, even though there were serious things going on. Contemporary, didn't get as much fun out of it. It was fun to look back on what it was like to be a teenager then. And then in the contemporary setting, because I had my two teenagers living at home, I really liked watching them. And even though it's such an atrocious time in many ways, it's also really fascinating. It was interesting to observe those commitments to those really deep friendships. Those concepts that you can't tell your parents anything because they're not going to understand. So I kind of felt like I had the best of both worlds. I had my experience of the 80s and my experience of teenagers now.
Your book is set about an hour out of Sydney. I think you're based in Canberra. What was it about that sort of positioning of your town that fed the story?
So when I started writing it, I didn't intend to set it loosely based around the Southern Highlands, but I'd actually spent a decade living in Mittagong, which I absolutely loved. And I just found it was such a mixture of people there. So you had people coming from Sydney who had a lot more money, and that sort of changed the look of the town. And even though locals knew that you have to have that new blood to survive, there's also a little bit of underlying, not resentment, just sort of an understanding that you're buying into this real estate, which means we now can't, and it creates divisions. So that was really interesting to me to look at that. And then there was also that disparity of wealth that feeds down into everything from schools. So I remember my daughter being at the local primary school, and she came home and said, there's a school excursion, and we were told to shut our eyes and put our hands up if we couldn't afford to go on the school excursion. And it was a gold coin. That was all it was going to be, for a sausage when they were there or whatever. And I had never heard of that before. And that sort of brought it home to me as well, that these kids are understanding from a very early age as well that the world is different for different people. So that little story actually made it into the book. It's what happens to Jack when she's at school. And I also really like the idea of the physical isolation. So even though you're still quite close to Sydney and Canberra, you can walk out your door in one direction and be in the middle of a vast national park, which, you know, is good for thinking about missing people. Or you can walk 2 minutes in the other direction and you'll be at the local supermarket knowing 10 other people. So it was that sort of conflict between the two.
Yep.
And just as I was writing it and describing the setting, I suddenly sort of realised, oh, this is actually more like the Southern Highlands than I originally tended.
And how deep were you sort of plotting? Were you sort of, are you the pantser or the plotter?
Terrible, really chaotic, really disorderly.
Yep.
And I really hoped that I would be better on my second novel and more orderly, and I'm absolutely not. So I will write a bit that might go here and then it'll be shifted to here. I have no idea what's happening here, but I know exactly what's going on there. It's really, really chaotic. And I really admire any writers from the olden days who were doing it in typewriters, because I just think it must have been a nightmare. Mine's all cutting and pasting and moving and then multiple drafts. I don't know how many drafts I get through, but it's a very messy process.
Because I was going to ask that, because all three of you are sort of dealing with, you know, dual time frames really, and how do you kind of manage, you know, that juggle, especially if you're not, you know, doing detailed plots? I mean, you said you're a plotter. Your background's television, so I'm guessing you're a plotter.
I'm a serious plotter. Yeah, I love a whiteboard,
Yep.
love cards, do all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, once you sort of go into a TV writer's room, you just can't escape that thinking.
It's fun though. I mean, my dream is to have a room where one wall is glass looking out to a garden, and the other 3 walls are all whiteboard. So I can put the
Yep.
plot and all the characters' journeys, their transformational arcs, the turning points. I can see the whole book in one field of vision. That's my dream.
Yeah, and look, this isn't about me, but I think with a whiteboard marker, so if I don't sort of doing this and talking, which is what you do in a TV room, I find it really difficult to kind of get the ideas flowing.
No, I always have to have a pen in my hand, even if I'm just thinking about ideas. I find that ideas will flow better if I have a pen in my hand. Even though I never write longhand, the actual outline or anything. Everything goes into the computer.
Yeah.
But it's that weird
It's a muscle
connection
memory.
between the hand and the brain.
Do you find you're old school with diaries and things like that as well, like pens and paper and scribbling notes? And
I don't do much of that anymore because I have arthritis
Oh,
in my hand, so I can't. I used to love notebooks and
Yeah.
pens and that, but yeah, no, it's fun though.
So sort of sticking with this, I mean, how extensive would an outline for you be?
for me,
Yeah, I'm going to go round.
extensive. I love post-it notes. Love post-it notes. I love coloured pens. I'd love a big whiteboard, but I get big sketch pads and use different coloured pens when I'm brainstorming. And there are things circled and attached to other things, and the colours all mean something, which I inevitably forget. And then I use Scrivener, which is the writing software where you can visually see. It's post-it notes in digital form, basically. And then, but I don't do a written outline. It's more the ideas process for me, and the connection of the story arcs and the timelines and the characters. All of that is very visual and pinned up. And you know, have you ever seen those crime shows where they have the incident room and they've got photos and then they've got red
The
lines?
murder wall.
The murder wall. That's what my plotting looks like, with, you know, visual aids and post-it notes and strings and lines, and it all makes sense to me only.
Yeah, how about you, Joan? Is it?
Yeah, I with Echo Lake, I did first an outline on a whiteboard. So I did it the way you do a feature film outline. So I had like a 3-act structure, and I structured the book I started structuring it in like 3 acts, and then I thought, wait a minute, it'll be a TV series that I can adapt since I'm a screenwriter. So I actually broke those 3 acts eventually down into 8 episodes. So
Oh,
there,
nice.
there are sort of, there are 8, if you look closely, there are actually sort of 8 sections with 8 sort of cliffhanger or turning points at the end of each. So I sort of embedded a TV series structure within the novel, which I thought was very sneaky.
Now I've got to go back and read it again. Yeah.
Just buy another copy and give it to someone else. But anyway, so I did a whiteboard outline, and then I transferred that to cards because I needed more detail than I could get, because I only have one whiteboard so far. I know.
That's why you need to buy the book.
Yeah, but and then after I put the scenes on cards, basically did what we call in screenwriting a scene breakdown on cards. Then I transferred the cards to a prose outline on my computer, and then I saved that as the first draft of the book. So as I was writing, I always had the rest of the book already written in outline form, which was so great because I've never experienced writer's block, and it's because the book's already there in front of me. I never have a blank page. So that was really handy.
And so if you're, how is your, rewriting process? Are you rereading what you've done the day before to kind
Yeah,
of?
which makes it really slow as well.
Yeah.
So I won't always intend to, but I'll start back at the first chapter and think I'm just going to skim over this, and then suddenly go, no, it's been 2 hours and I'm still back in it. But then I find getting that right early on means by the time I come to the end, it's a lot cleaner to get there and do it. And things change the whole way through. I don't have any clear idea when I'm starting how it's going to finish or what's going to happen. I usually know what's there, but I don't know how I'm going to get there.
Yeah.
So yeah, very, very messy and chaotic, and lots of post-it notes and scrappy bits of things in bags and drawers. And I think my latest, when I opened up the latest draft I had, which was November 2023, I had see August 2023. It's no help whatsoever.
Well, I think we should probably move forward to another book. And so, Joan, I found this great, this quote is in my head. I've been trying to find who said it. I think it's William Goldman, but he said, novelists make lousy screenwriters, but screenwriters make great novelists, which I think is really weird because he was a novelist first. But anyway, your background is in TV. You kind of talked about that sort of process of developing the story. Was there a lot of research you had to do to kind of create your Highland story?
All the research to create the Highland story was actually just me living there.
Yep.
And unlike a lot of books where they'll sort of be inspired by a real place but sort of fictionalize the names, and I used all the real names of the towns, I even named the pastry shop where I would buy my, Gumnut Patisserie, and the Mossvale Dog Park, and Dirty Jane's, the antique shop in Bowral. So I named them all, and for a while they were just placeholders because I was thinking, well, I'll have to change it. And then I asked, the people who owned these businesses, and they were like, oh my God, great publicity for us, leave it in. So I did, to the point of, it's a spoiler, so I won't say it, but one of the main characters in Echo Lake, who may or may not turn out to be the murderer, is based on someone real, and I had to get that person's permission to perhaps make them a suspect or a villain. Anyway, that person, notice how good I was, not giving away the gender? That person loved this fact. So my research was really, as with most novelists, I think we just scavenge from our own real life and real experience. But where my research showed up was you'll get this, all of the stories that I have, my character, who's a historian, all of her projects that she's working on as a researcher are actually projects of mine that as a screenwriter I was developing but never got made. So because I thought, God, I did all this research for those projects, like The Children of the First Fleet and The Woman Who Wrote Waltzing Matilda and things, and they never got made. But so I thought, I'll have my historian be working on that project, so I'll get those stories out there somehow. So it's that weird scavenging thing where you collect information from different areas of your life, but it didn't feel like I had to sit down and do new research for Echo Lake.
What about in terms of making that jump from screen to page? I was at the session yesterday with Sarah Smith and Elizabeth Coleman, and Roger Simpson said the same thing as well, that it's the describing the scene that they had to learn how to do. Was that something that you had to?
I didn't, it's funny, I didn't find describing the scene hard. I found the internal monologue of the character. That was weird for me because in screenwriting, you have to convey the subtext or the inner emotional world of your characters through action and behavior or dialogue. And I started writing the book like that. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm allowed to get into her head. I'm allowed to tell the reader what she's thinking. And it took me, I remember a few days where I was like, you can go there, you can go there. And once I did, I found it really hard then going back to screenwriting because I was like, how are they gonna know what she's thinking, you know? I'll have to have her act it out, which is a lot harder. And I think that's why screenwriting is much harder writing than writing prose in fiction. So I really, for me the transition was tricky, but now that I feel like I'm there, I'm much happier there.
I had a question that came out of that, but I've forgotten it. You sort of, you have, that's what it was, cozy crime. It's been described as cozy crime. Are you comfortable with that label?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it isn't cozy crime in the sort of Richard Osman Thursday Murder Club cozy. It's there's a darker edge to it.
Yeah.
But I think the reason the cozy crime description works is because I was very conscious about wanting to create a cozy atmosphere. I love books that make me want to go and stay with that main character. I want to move into their house. There's a series of the Ruth Galloway mysteries. It's an English series. It's not that popular here, but I loved it. There were 15 books in the series, and it's about a forensic archaeologist who lives on the north coast of Norfolk in England on the salt marsh, and she lives with her cat, and it's this cozy little cottage. And when I read that first book, it was like, I want to move in with Ruth, you know. I want to go there. And so I wanted to create a kind of destination book that would have a cozy atmosphere with characters who were really likable and warm. Also because those are the relationships I have. Those are the people I know. I don't know a lot of psychopathic killers or dark, haunted lunatics and junkies and bipolar. I mean, fiction now, so much of crime in particular, your main character often has to be so damaged and so, they have to have an addiction or they have to have a mental health crisis or they have to, and I thought, well, that's fine, and I love reading those books, but I wanted to create characters that were more like something out of an Alexander McCall Smith book. 44 Scotland Street. I mean, I love those books because those people are so lovely. And so I wanted to create that as the sort of core in terms of characters and settings, and then give it a really nasty edge. So it's sort of cozy with an edge, if I can rebrand it like that.
Yeah, go for it. I think that's the great thing about crime is that sort of there's a type for everybody, and it's the marketers that get to sort of label these things. We're not always comfortable with how our books might be presented to the booksellers, but yeah, no, you can find whatever you want. If you want to find a murder mystery that's got a talking cat, there's plenty of those out there. Are you comfortable sitting in the thriller genre, Lucy?
Look, I think you're right. It's entirely a marketing thing. You don't necessarily sit down to write to this genre or picturing where it's going to be on the shelf. You're just writing what you hope is a good story. And after that, it's sort of out of your hands. So you do get a say in things like cover and blurb and all that sort of thing. But obviously at that stage, the publisher is seeing it in a very different way to the way you view it.
Yep.
So I think you have to obviously have input, but also be prepared to let go and say, it's in your hands now. Yeah, it's a funny one. It's a strange one think about. Because especially when mine came out, someone put on Twitter, why is it that all crime novels at this moment have got yellow writing? And he screenshot about 20 of them, and they all looked exactly the same. And you can see, you know why from a marketing point of view, that someone's going to walk in and say, you know, this is the sort of crime that I want to read. I can choose from these ones. But at the same time, nothing pops out anymore. It's all
Yeah.
sort of the
Dark
same.
colours, woman walking
Yeah,
away.
yeah. Or a window.
Yep.
The window is good.
Mm.
So yeah, there's certain ways that it's done, but I'm not entirely convinced that they're necessarily the best way of doing things. But obviously, the booksellers and the marketers would know a lot more about it than I do.
Mm. Joe, I haven't forgotten you. Yeah. And the reason I was asking the other authors that question is that with your book, it has a really, really strong romance through it. So is your book a romance with a crime, or is it a crime with a romance?
I wouldn't even call it romance, because romance, if we use the word romance, we expect a happy ever after. I like to say love story,
Okay.
because a love story doesn't necessarily have a happy ever after. Love stories can be tragic, or open-ended, or not work out well. So I'd call it a love story. In fact, there's two probably love stories in it. They're secondary, but they're also integral to the story that unfolds. The story that happens in the 1986 timeline is completely hinges around the love story that's there. So one thing leads to another. So I'd probably say crime with love story. Yes,
Yep.
I'll go with that.
Because it's really integral. I mean, without that, the love story, you know, that story wouldn't really
Wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have happened. And the love story in the present timeline, or 2017, is almost a sidebar to what's happening for that character. So Olivia in 2017 has made some terrible mistakes. She's run away to Tasmania, because that's where people run away to. And the love story that happens for her is to the side of what else is going on in her life. And there's no resolution to that. It's not a spoiler. There's no happy ever after at this stage.
It's not the way I read it. It was happily ever.
Yeah.
I have had people ask me, could I write a sequel? Because what happens next? So there's still enough open there for people to wonder what happens to them.
I was interested in your Harlequin imprint, because I always associated Harlan with more hardcore romance than yours. So has that changed? Or?
It has quite a bit. Harlequin was, of course, known for Mills and Boon, because they acquired Mills and Boon. They have diversified dramatically, particularly here in Australia. So they're an imprint of HarperCollins, but they've now got a lot of crime. And
Yep. Sarah
women's
Barry's one of them.
Sarah Barry is Harlequin. I'm racking my brain for everyone else who's on the list, but they've certainly diversified. And there's still probably a branding issue with that. So the imprint now is just HQ. So it's on the spine, it's HQ, and we call it HarperCollins, or Harlequin HarperCollins. But yeah, it's something that has to be slowly evolving over time. Yeah.
Again, I asked the other panelists kind of similar questions, but did you enjoy exploring those two time frames, or was it sort of a necessity to kind of go to the past to explain the present?
This book actually evolved as two separate stories. So on those long drives of mine, I was trying to dig up plots and what have you, and I actually came up with two completely separate stories. And then somewhere in the process, they melded together and fitted together so beautifully. And lo and behold, I had a book with two timelines and two story arcs in it. I loved writing it, and I'm quite strange in a dual timeline. As a dual timeline writer, I wrote it linear. So I didn't write one timeline and write the other and then fit them together. I wrote it in the format that it is. So 3 chapters and then a couple more in the other timeline, then back to that one. And for me, I found a rhythm in it. and I find it really hard to explain how it came about. I could just get a sense of when I was writing, when it was time. It was time to go back to the 1986 story, or the rhythm of the story dictated that it was time to come back to the present day. And of course, that delightful, which I'm sure you guys, you did, dual timeline, Lucy did so well as well, where you leave enough at the end of a chapter that if you're diving back into the other timeline, people go, I've got to go back there. Oh, but we're back here. Oh, yes, I need to know what happens here, so that you're always keeping people wanting more of where they're not. Does that make sense?
And did your characters ever surprise you in that?
Yes. I'm definitely a plotter, and I had most of this book nutted out, and I was up to about the 4th draft, and I'm going to circle around this because I don't want to give anything away, but there is something that happens.
Is this the alien?
This is the alien invasion, which was unexpected in rural Tasmania. No, but there is something that happens, and it was about the 4th or 5th draft, so I was really tightening the book up, and suddenly this scene popped into my head, and I wrote that chapter. It was so unexpected. I thought I knew what had happened in this book. I thought I knew who'd done it. And this chapter emerged, and it came out, and it's the only experience I've had of this. Other writers talk about it happening, where this chapter came out fully formed, and pretty much the way I wrote it that day, it's the way it is still in the book today. And people go, oh, wow, I didn't see that coming. And I go, no, neither did I.
It's sort of it's funny how it's sort of Tasmania it's sort of become, it's a real hotbed for creativity at the moment. We've got TV shows coming out. There's a whole lot of.
We're very on trend.
Yeah. Created your own market.
Which is fantastic, because we were the butt of the joke for a long time, and we still are, let's face it. But Tasmania is perceived as being quite other. We're this little island off, and we're an hour from Melbourne. We're not even 2 hours from Sydney. But it's seen as being a different place and a little bit strange, and some really odd people. So it's been a great place for people to run away to, myself included. I came from the mainland, as we call it. So I landed in Tasmania 12 years ago. But I think it's on trend because it is a little bit different. It's still a little bit, I was going to say exotic, but... And I've spoken to a lot of people on the mainland who say, oh, I'd love to go to Tasmania. And I'm going, it's just there. It's not that hard. And we're not that different. I just on that note, I follow a Facebook group of people who are coming to Tasmania, and they're talking about travelling around, and the questions that come out are gorgeous. And the locals who respond to these are so helpful. Are there ATMs? Genuinely, that was a question that was posed. Are the supermarkets open on a Sunday? Well,
Can you drink the water?
yeah, oh yeah, you can drink the water. The water's good. And I think, as far as being a bed of creativity, there's a lot of really, really excellent writers down there, and of course the location for filming. The shows that have come out are great. Some of them are met with cooler receptions in Tasmania, but every time there's a film crew in Tassie, it's like, yay! It's great.
Yeah. Now, we're approaching that point where we're going to start taking questions from the floor. So I hope you've all been listening and thinking and coming up with some good questions. 'Cause I've got a couple more, and I don't know whether we've had any from our Zoom chat yet, but oh, okay, they're still on their first coffee. So I suppose we'll go back to some more general sort of questions for the panel, and what I was going to sort of ask is, we often kind of talk about our characters going on a journey. They kind of start at one point, at the end they're changed. And I was wondering whether you feel like you've changed through the process of your book, whether, you've learnt more about yourself as a writer, or whether you just, one book was enough.
I feel you learn a lot about discipline, because writing is such a solitary thing that you know, no one else can do it for you, no matter how you sit there and bang your head against the keyboard and throw tantrums and whatever else when things aren't going well. It's not going to happen unless you sit there and do it. So I think finding that out is a nice, you know, it's a strength. And sometimes some of the things that, you know, I used to do a lot of marathon running, and sometimes that felt like it was a little bit selfish, like I was taking off for hours at a time and leaving my husband with the 3 kids to go out for a nice run. Whereas at least with writing, it sounds a lot more serious. I feel like I've got something at the end of it, and it's a little bit, you know, a bit worthy. So yeah, I really enjoy that aspect of it. And I don't think I knew I was disciplined in some respects, but I didn't know that I'd have the discipline to sit and write a whole book on my own.
It's funny because we often kind of hear, you know, novel writing being described as a marathon, and I've never met someone who's run a marathon. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, it is. A lot of the thinking that I do is when I'm out walking or running. That's a really good time for me to be in my head and sorting things out. And the difference was coming back home and putting it on paper rather than just forgetting it. But it is because, you know, you're thinking about the long race. It's every little step towards the finish line. And it requires control and discipline. So I think there's a lot of similarities there.
Okay, heard it here. Anyone else want to kind of comment on change?
It's interesting because I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think what I did learn writing the first book, Writing Echo Lake, was about what things are important to me in a way that I hadn't been aware of before. So, for instance, I had plotted the story because I always knew I wanted to do murder mysteries, and that was the thing. But what I didn't realize was that there's a sort of a slightly supernatural subplot in Echo Lake, and I hadn't even planned to put that in. And it actually it comes from a couple of experiences that I've had myself that are sort of a dark secret, where I've had very clear contact with something that happened in the past, or maybe a ghost, or whatever you want to call it. But I don't tell people because they'd look at you like you're suddenly a weirdo, and I'm already a weirdo. So I was like, I don't need to give them more fuel. But when I was working on the book, I thought, no, because this book is about, what it's about more than murder is it's about people and the way they connect to place, and the way they connect to country. Even white people connect to country in a way that I think we talk about it in terms of country and connection among First Nations people all the time, but we talk about it less for ourselves, for white people, and I think it's because we do have a greater degree of estrangement from nature and from the bush. So, which is very much why I wanted to have my character her favorite thing be bushwalking. But when she's on her bushwalks, the first time she has an experience that completely freaks her out. I hadn't planned to put that in the book, but when I got there, I was like, no, this is what the book is actually about. So in the process of writing my murder mystery, I realized it was a story about country, and I learned that that was what was more important to me. So that was an exciting sort of revelation that, and the second book is even sort of more about that, so.
The only thing I've probably got to add to that is when you realise just how resilient you are, like you do this thing in a void for years, this writing gig, and people just look at you and nod and smile. Yeah, she's writing a book. She's been saying that for years. And you have to just push through. There's no one offering you there's a reward dangled at the end, but you know, it's no guarantee you're ever going to get to that point. So you've got resilience. You've got to push through. And probably for me, the end result of that is, and I mean this humbly, is I'm so goddamn proud that I actually achieved this thing that took so long to get to this point. So, yeah.
And you've all got follow-up books coming out soon. How did how did your process change with the second book?
For me, my 2 manuscripts were both written before I got a contract. So I'd finished The House of Now and Then and put it aside because nobody wanted it. And it was rejected multiple times, beautifully rejected. So I started another one, wrote a second manuscript. And then when I pitched The House of Now and Then successfully, the publisher I pitched it to said, "What else have you got?" And I said, "Oh, look, here we go. Here's two. Here's number two." And she said, "I'll take both." So for me, the difference is now writing book 3 and book 4. And I've got more confidence, I would say, is the major difference. I've got more confidence in the process and that I can do this to a certain standard. So I'm going in with vigour and a deadline. That's the big difference.
Yes. The immovable deadline. Well, does anyone else want to chime in on that one? Or
I'll just say that my process hasn't changed at all. I really hope that it might.
there's
I would
time.
become a little bit more organised and know what I was doing, and I haven't at all. But I think I've just got to accept that that's the way I write, and that's fine, and enjoy it.
Yep.
Yeah, I just, my process has been the same, partly because Echo Lake was always intended as the first in a series, because what I always wanted to write was, you know, the Adam Dalgliesh novels or Jimmy Perez. I mean, Vera, Shetland, all my favorite crime books are parts of series. So this was always intended to be just the first in the series. So I've actually got the next few books plotted.
Yep.
In case you're interested.
That's the TV thinking as well. You're thinking of multiple series.
Well, it's the television background too. Yeah, thinking always in terms of how to keep it going, and what everyone nowadays, they want a returnable series, and for me that applies to books as much as television. So,
Well, do we have any questions from the floor? I think I saw someone over this side. No. Oh, over there. KT.
Hi, my name is Carrie. I'm really excited to be here. Lovely panel, learned a lot. I was really struck by Andy's questions and some of your responses about dual timelines. And, hearing the experience, readers want to be here and they want to be there. And I'm struggling with my dual timelines. So I want to hear from you how you did it, How do you build up one timeline and then skip to the other and still maintain that interest and not have the reader drop off, at that time? Because the reader's like, I've got to this point, and then I've got to the second timeline, I've got to start again, get to know this whole setting, this whole characters again. How do you do it? How do you skip to the second timeline, the first time, and still engage people?
Great question.
Okay, I'm going to try and break it down. Knowing both stories. So I think in my own experience, I couldn't have done it if I hadn't plotted both stories out. So I had to know how the story arcs of both of them and how those stories were connected. So the points at which they bumped against each other, if you like. So if, for example, something is revealed in the present timeline, we revealed it, and I'll just try and make this up off the top of my head so I'm not giving anything away, that Bob and Mary were brother and sister. So in the present timeline, you suddenly have it revealed, and then in the past timeline, you drop into a scene that has Bob and Mary in it, so that there's a connection between the two timelines, the two chapters. And then to leave, when you skip out of a timeline and back to the alternate one, is to leave that last chapter with very much a hook. There, and again something that references where you're going to drop into the other timeline, so that there's this little connection like buttons at the end of each connecting chapter. So for me it wasn't one chapter, it was 2 or 3 chapters in one timeline, back to the other one for 2 or 3 chapters and back again. But always when I did those switches, making sure that there was something that connected the timelines, and then there was a hook there that would leave readers thinking, I've got to, no, don't take me away. Don't take me away from this timeline. I want to know what happens. Oh, but wait, now we're about to find out what happened in 2017. So it's they always say leave a chapter with a hook. It's even more so important when you're doing dual timelines.
You can also think about it. I know it's a hard thing to do, but you can make it sound, to yourself at least, easier by thinking of those early chapters. Like one timeline is where you put your hints, And in the second timeline, that's where you're finding your answers. So you can just build or drop little clues in to one particular time frame and then pull them out or tease them out in the second one. So you just have to not think that it's hard and find an easy way of thinking about it. Don't talk yourself out of it.
Have another question from the floor? Yep, same row. I think this is the Westwards contingent.
Okay. Hi, my name's Joanne. I just had a question, and it goes for both pantsers and plotters. I'd like to say I'm a proud pantser, but we'll see what happens when the book gets finished, whether I'm still of that mindset. When you develop your characters at the start of your writing process, would you say that you have your characters built up enough, or would you say that you learn more about them throughout the whole process and their personality changes or their likability or their connections with other people changes? Like how detailed is your character description from the start versus the finish?
It's a great question, and I know people do it different ways, but the way I find most useful, it's the same with plotting and with character. I like to have a really detailed biography of certainly my main character. And I know so much about her, and I've also plotted out her whole emotional arc. But then once you get in there and you're writing, and we've talked about this just before, she might do something and I'll be like, oh, Rose, I didn't know you were capable of that. And then she's like, oh yeah, watch this. And so you always have this sort of your pre-plotted transformational arc to go back to, but she can surprise you, and sometimes it's a lot and sometimes it's just a little, and that is the greatest pleasure in writing, when your characters are so full of real life and they're flesh and blood and they surprise you, but they still maintain the integrity of that character you invented. So I think you have to plan assiduously, but then be free and open yourself to deviate from that path once you're inside it.
I've got to say that despite being a plotter, my characters don't often become fully fleshed until well into second or third drafts. I've got a vague idea of what type of person they are, but some characters, and not all of them, but some of them just evolve as the writing evolves. In fact, there was one character that didn't really take any shape until editing. Like, I was over the line, I had a deal, and the editor was saying, this character's really boring, bland, and I went, you're right. Went back to the drawing board on it. So for me, it was, those characters some of them didn't even appear fully fleshed until right before publication, which is scary.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. Mine changed drastically between start and finish of multiple drafts, and you get to a certain point and think, something late in the draft, I'll have them saying one thing, and then I'll think, no, that doesn't fit in with what they've said earlier, and then I will go back and rewrite them from the start because I like them better the way they've turned out than the way they started.
I have a question in the second room.
Another character question. It's just about whether you think about the physicality of the characters when you're writing them, and do you actually describe them? This is obviously a big discussion at the moment because, we're not trying to work out maybe the race of the character or the social background of the character, or whether they're skinny or larger or that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a really complicated area. I'm just interested to know how you all deal with that.
I think that my thoughts on this have evolved as it is evolving in general discussion. When I started 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I thought it was really important to know the colour of eyes, colour of hair, exactly what they look like, without them looking in a mirror to tell you that, how to get around that. Now I'm just brushing over it with the lightest of touches, just enough to know that they are. If their physicality affects the story, it's worth putting in. if it doesn't, it's almost irrelevant.
Yeah, I think I try to use a very light touch describing characters, but I also think you can make the mistake of not describing them at all because they're too amorphous, they're too homogenous, they're too vague. And I think, you know, it's fine to describe a character as white or black or a person of color or Asian. Those things are part of the character and part of their cultural heritage and the legacy of all sorts of things in their lives. So I think it's, you know, you can't be all things to all people. Your characters need to be grounded in some sort of physical reality. Yeah.
And I would probably over-describe my characters initially and then pull it back as I go if I think that I've gone too heavily overboard. But I do remember in one draft of Lowbridge, I had described a doctor in the country town as a young Asian woman, and my editor got back to me and said, you don't need to say that she's Asian, it doesn't add anything to the story. And I had kind of thought, surely all these things make up who you are. And no, she's a minor character, but that was the representation in the country town I was thinking of doctors, but it was seen as not being necessary to the story. So then I pulled that out, and I don't think I had a single non-white character in there. So yeah, there's a funny thing between diversity and, you know, how you can do it.
I wonder if
Weirdly.
it comes down to, rather than us, you know, putting in a description of what the person looks like, and seeing, rather than perhaps moving more towards seeing the characters through other characters' eyes, so how they respond to that. So, for example, if it's someone that someone's got a prejudice against, we're going to see that physicality through the reaction of another character,
Yeah.
rather than describing it. It's just a thought that I'm probably going to start playing around with a little bit.
I've got a couple of questions, but I think we've actually run out of time, unfortunately. So please put your hands together and welcome and thank our panel. And remember that they will be signing books very shortly outside. Christmas is coming up. Books are good presents.